That's number 2 that we've done, Philip and I. Go ahead, Philip.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the relationships across cultures. And today we're going to talk about our relationship across the different cultures and our many other ones, particularly this past year in this very political time of life. A lot of what you'll see today, and this is how Marcy and I like to engage too, is we're going to be doing this kind of as a state of process. We're going to be going through this as engagement. So you'll witness what maybe it's like. We talk about our relationship and we talk about other relationships and why this is important for us and it's been and ideas and ways to help foster and maybe work through across different cultures. So we'll talk about a few different things like that.
Yeah. And we're hoping that you will throw some questions our way because we want this to be as much of a group dialogue as we can make it over the internet, such as it is. And this is something that, as Philip and I have started to work together, just came up in the groups that we've done. Actually, we've done one big group. I think we mentioned at the end of the last webinar that we did, and that was actually, I think it went really well, and we had a good experience with people really working difference through dialogue and staying in the process. So I think that seeing just either locally, but also nationally and hopefully internationally, people are really trying to find ways to connect in these really politically polarizing times. What inspired us to have this talk and to have it in terms of being more of a process and not so much drawing down on research and theory and all that, and by all means important stuff and it's out there. There's a lot more out there than there used to be, so we do encourage everyone to go out there and dig a little deeper if you want to find breaking research about things like implicit bias and both in psychology and all other fields. So but we're just going to kind of jump into it and start talking. And I'm going to put on my glasses every once in a while because I'm kind of at that age, so I can read whatever questions are coming up. And I see that we have on.
They're saying hello. So
hello.
Hello,
Hi.
everyone.
Hello. Okay. So where should we start, Phil?
Oh, gosh. Well, the first question that pops into my mind is thinking about how politicized things are right now, particularly with the last year's election and causing polar sides to pop out more and more. And as I see that more and more, I even see people starting to share and becoming more agitated and more frustrated with each other. And it cultures, but a lot of times it is. And it's a lot of times I see also across different ideologies or views of how to talk about things. So I guess in that, it made me think about how we talk about these things. So it might be kind of a basing while we're doing our process, of course, but a basing for people to really get an idea of how this might look today. But before we were doing this, we were talking a lot about just how we view these conversations. And I know
starting from when you and I first met. And so I think because of what's been going on and the work that I know I wanted to do as a therapist, I found out about Philip through other friends of mine that said, okay, he's working on specifically white privilege. And I said, you know what, I want to work with someone that has that knowledge, but also is having that process be something that they're working on. Because as someone like myself that wants to work with cross-cultural communications, as a person of color, as a multicultural woman, but as many of you know out there that do this work, it's a lot of heavy lifting to try to balance out, perhaps a white person's perspective and their process along with people of color and those of us that identify as multicultural. Points are so important. And I think, when Philip and I first met, honestly, it was sort of, we weren't quite sure because we didn't know each other at all. So it took a few times. Yeah, we were both nervous about it. And I think as we saw each other, actually it was when we met each other in a place that's really dear to my heart, which is Safe House Progressive Alliance for Nonviolence, where I did my internship with a colleague of mine. And I think that was kind of the turning point, because I know that you saw me in an environment that I was totally comfortable in. And so Philip got to see me a little bit more engaged. And I think that's kind of important to when we're talking about how these relationships form, is that you feel like you're in your element when you feel like you're supported by your community, wherever that place is, and you come to a relationship from that place. There's much more ease in kind of, I think, reaching out a hand to connect. So
yeah.
I don't know if you remember that the same way.
Yeah, no, I think I went there to, just to meet everyone, and I got to meet you. I think it was maybe our second time meeting, but it was the first time I got to see you in a different kind of frame. Yeah. And it did feel different. You seemed comfortable. You seemed more lively or more engaging, and that's understandable. Our first time meeting, and possibly understandable. Like, we're coming from very different cultural backgrounds. And, the first time meeting was probably like, okay, who is this person? Let me figure this out. Which is like abnormal, but I think also dealing with our power and privilege dynamic too, and oppression dynamic, and I think that came up right away. You were very warm, I will say. When I first met, I remember you opening your arms, being like, "Oh, I like hugs." I'm like, "Okay," which we'll get into some of these components of different cultural backgrounds, what you're used to, and what that feels like. And it's not that I'm not used to hugs, but it was a different perspective. So at the Safe House, I saw you really comfortable in an environment that I was still trying to navigate and understand where was my place here, and trying to meet and not walk on toes, and notice my own power in that dynamic. And doing all this, I just felt anxious. Really, I was like, okay, there's a lot of things I'm trying to work at once. And I've been welcomed back. It's a really great place. I like the people there, was particularly what they're doing. But I do remember that. And you were talking earlier about what gravitated you. I think for me, it was to meet someone, most importantly, around cultural work, and how to look at this not from always just an identity perspective, but also like, how do we talk about this so we engage with it? And we'll probably get into that more. But it's something I really appreciate about you is thinking about the cultural component more conversation. I remember you led a training for my team, which I thought was really good. You're like, what's the difference between in our culture? And I noticed right away when you put us through this training, it's like, when you just do your identity, and that could be like, for example, a white man. There's not a lot to connect on there usually. And you're like, but let's hear about the culture you're coming from, and then you can see these things you're interested, you're curious. In doing that allowed conversations.
Maybe we do jump into it, because I think one of the big things coming up for me, and that we've talked about too, is today, I think in social media, but also in trainings and other kinds of venues where you talk about social justice, but also bridging difference. There is a lot of polarizing activity going on, and I'm beginning to wonder, and I'm really curious for those of you that are listening to us right now, how people feel about what they see maybe happening as being almost an absolutist movement, if that's a word, but on either side, either really conservative or also kind of on the liberal side of how we say things, when we say things, the languaging that we use, kind of the discussion, the way the discussions go. And what I mean by that more specifically is kind of mixing the discussion between kind of an interpersonal level and an institutional level of oppression. So when we're talking about institutional racism, how that sometimes can come out in the interpersonal and kind of block our means of connecting with other people, because we are seeing that other person sort of in that political identity is what Philip was saying, I was kind of introducing. And maybe just to be clear, what I mean by that is, at least in the United States, we have a history, at least, from the time that the census was created, for categorizing people according to race, right? Of many, many ways of categorizing, but one of those is, this is the one with the most impact on us today. So as we classify ourselves by those boxes, we also limit ourselves in terms of the information that we can share with others, but also how others can get to know us. A different way of identifying in terms of cultural background, I'm finding that there's a way to connect with people that doesn't diminish the importance of understanding the racial component, and the privilege and the oppression piece, in the space with more information where you can connect.
Mhm.
So what I'm afraid of is that we're losing maybe that more subtle discussion of what my background is, what my history is, what my stories are, immediately seen as a person of color. And in that sense, I'm supposed to be, verbalizing my experience in XYZ ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just so everybody knows, it doesn't mean we don't believe those identities
Right.
are important.
Yeah.
A huge piece of what we're talking about is relationships across cultures. So we're going to be
Mhm.
focusing on that cultural component more. So those identities are still important. There are a lot of importances to learn, and the hardships involved in some, and the power involved in others.
Mhm.
But in that, we're talking about the cultural differences. We work in relationships with those, and that's where we find, when we look at that cultural piece, I think we're able to find things to connect with.
Mhm.
And I think that's true in our experiences.
Mhm.
As you've talked a lot about your culture. I remember first meeting you, it's like, this is the work I'm doing.
Mhm.
It's identity work, but it's cultural work. I'm looking at cultural work. And so I guess that polaris we were originally talking about, and I was thinking about how in today's world, there's a lot, as a political world, I'm seeing people separate. And you were talking about this earlier, but people separating from one side to the next and being very, that's the way, or this is how you should see it, and then combating each other from these far apart. And I have this visual in my mind almost of like, there's these two far ends, and I'm not going to say spectrums of political side, but there's these far ends, beliefs of how to connect and around identity, and who should be here or not, or how things should be done or said, and it almost feels like there's this like battlefield. There's all the rest of the people with a whole lot of other opinions too, and there's these two sides fighting from really far, and everyone's getting. Think of the work, particularly we did at the institute we ran, which was on race and racism with our colleague Marseille, which we hope to go again. We'll talk about later.
Yeah.
But when we did that, one thing we were doing is saying, these sides to connect. Who wants to have a conversation right now?
Right.
Because part of that conversation might mean we're not here so much to shame or guilt or attack or feel like blamed. We're here to have a conversation. And in that, those emotions come up as we witnessed and have felt ourselves. I felt it. But we also note, I think, what I get with you is it's a feeling conversation. Like, what is happening here? How are we feeling? What's engaging us? What's keeping us disengaged? And, I guess bring this up because that's my hardship, is seeing these two sides. Is like, no, you have to feel shame or guilt for this, or no, I don't want any people of color around me. And that's really unfortunate, because you were saying earlier, maybe you can say more about.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's important to that we're living in a time where social change is happening so quickly, and I think so necessarily. I mean, we have a lot of shadow pieces to this society that are coming up really forceful ways, and I think that we absolutely need to do that. I mean, I'm thinking of the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, Native rights, all of these kind of things. They have to come up. We have to be seen in that.
Very important.
And the energy behind that is going to be activist energy. It's going to be fire, necessary for that. I think where I want to work, where I want to focus, is what happens after the fire. Bring all those conversations up to consciousness, with the anger and the pain and the trauma and all of that behind it. It has to go somewhere. And so those next steps somewhere can either be a place of isolation and separation, coming together. And I think if you look at this country, there's been such an opportunity, starting with my parents, of marriage, intercultural marriage. People come together because they find something in each other. I think there shouldn't be shame in that choice. And I wonder if now, with all of these issues coming up, behind whether or not I should be in, a friendship or a relationship with someone that's not of my hope is that the answer is, that people still stay open to that, because I think that's where we develop greater empathy.
So how do we do that?
How do we do that? Yeah, that's one of our questions.
Yeah.
So again, lots of research on this topic. I think a couple things that have popped up for me that I've seen is related, honestly, to kind of our, you know, to the neuroscience of difference. You know, it's really that awareness around what our brains are meant to do when we're faced with difference in someone else, in such a way to react to that.
Yeah.
And that can be, you know, is that person a threat? Are they a friend? Are they a potential mate? And knowing that that's where we go right away.
What do you do?
How do I do it? I find places where in common beyond just my racial ethnic background. So like with you, it was the work that we do as therapists, right? I think another example is I go to a summer institute on intercultural communication because I know I'm going to find a world there, and I just love that, you know. And what we're learning, yeah, they're workshops, but it's more for me about the connection with people there. And if I'm going to be in a place where I'm the only person, you know, that has my background, really aware of how that sits with me and how much I feel like I want to reach out, or so it's a little bit more mindful, I think, when I'm in those environments.
I like what you said about the connection piece. I had a colleague years ago was feeling isolated in a situation, and was feeling kind of outcast and feeling alone. And I looked towards me for connect with me on, and I'm not going to share specifics of it, but how can I connect right now? Okay, I connect with you over, and for them at the time, it was really, really important, and it was something that they needed at the moment too. So although a lot of our main identities, as we put it, the identity work, all, we found something that made enough that we could have this conversation, the person could feel cared for, and
was that person of a different racial background than you, or
racial, gender,
and gender? Okay.
Yeah. It I think a lot happening, but and keep that kind of conversation more secretive, but brought up when I was thinking about what we were talking about, finding something to connect with. And, I think before this conversation, I was thinking like, well, how do we talk about this? This has been a year. You know, I think for me, one of the things was reaching out, and, you know, meeting you was great because that happened during this very political time. And I'll say that there's a time that's more, but I think that more has come up this last year, particularly around anger, frustration. It's pretty obvious since, you know, the election and during the election, a lot has come up for people on both sides of the spectrum. And so I think one thing I was reaching for too was to have, you know, the person to have more conversations about how can we connect across different cultures, racial backgrounds, gender, you name it. And I think that is tricky because that was my goal, was to find someone to do that. And the question we're asking here is, how do you create relationships across cultures? When I ask that very broad question, the very first thing that comes to my head is things difference more often. And no matter where you are living, it might be good to take a step away from what you're used to and engaging in something that you might not. So even asking that question, where do I not know?
Right. I mean, and you know, people who live in Boulder, I mean, know that it's,
and this Boulder's very specific.
Boulder's very specific that way. You know, and I've had conversations with friends that have come from the East Coast, West Coast, diversity for granted, you know, because you would walk anywhere and you would see people of different backgrounds, hear different languages. So it does get difficult if you're living in a place that's not going to have the kind of diversity that is just around you. And how do you seek it out without looking like you're seeking it out, you know, on purpose? I think it's, you know, it's what Philip was saying, is that you find those environments, you know, whether it's through travel, whether it's through activities, you know, something as simple as maybe, you know, neighborhood that you've not been to before, and just being there, you know, and understanding that, you know, you're not there as far as like, you know, anthropological, research or anything else. It's something that has to mean something to you and that you want to be a part of. So again, I think it's finding commonality. So finding what your, if it's your profession, if it's, your kid's school, sports, finding those environments where you can make that first step is important.
Yeah. I think as we've built trust, we've been able to have more difficult conversations. And so, we know as therapists too, like the most important thing you can do is build a relationship with your client and build trust with them so that you can do some of the harder work.
Oop, I see a question.
Well, we'll jump to your question.
We'll jump to the question in a second. Okay.
And even if it's through sports or through whatever it might be, building that trust a bit, so that you might be able to, if that comes up, you might have the trust enough to talk to each other, or to share, like, hey, this what you're saying right now is really not feeling good. Can we talk about that? You now have that background. I think at some point it'd be good for us just talk briefly and not getting too much to it, but to an extent, we're both in different cross-cultural relationships,
right?
And romantic ones, and obviously we have our friendship ones. So questions that'll come up, and we're going to read the questions that are popping up. So thank you. Navigate those, right? Given those cultural differences come up, I know I've being like, okay,
this
means something differently. We communicate differently.
Right.
We engage differently. We think about this differently. So it's and for me, it's been about trying to recognize that there's a difference and just in the conversation and not take judgment.
Right.
It's been easier than I thought it would, actually. I think I
think because you've been doing this work professionally.
Probably, but it was still harder than I thought, because I think a lot of times we would just, and I'm sure in my past I have too, just made a judgment. Well, why don't you understand this? Because well, there's a very different cultural background here that's saying a very different story that they've taught.
Yeah.
So it's trying to understand each other's culture, which is really intimate. Each other quite intimate. And you've had a much longer romantic relationship than I have, so
that's true.
Yeah, how that's gone.
Yes, it's true. Take a look at this quick question here and see
if
we're leaning in, and here come the glasses. So okay. Can you understand your own personal biases, beliefs, understand, assess if those views contribute to hurting that group? That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think that
more than a question,
more than a question, statement. This is where I think we're asking people to really start holding two levels of awareness. One is you're going to have your personal experience with individuals, but then you also need to have what we were talking about before, the awareness about biases, power, oppression, privilege, all of those that might be part of that person's story, right? So not making assumptions, but also holding that in the background, always running in the background, If there's a question that comes up in yourself, you give yourself enough space between your action and reaction, so that you can take those things into consideration.
Yeah.
The cultural piece to that too also encompasses the awareness around different communication styles, different nonverbal communication, different levels of comfort with hugs, or other kinds of, interpersonal space, and really that pause to go, okay, this thing happened, whatever the thing is, what else do I not know? What's not part of what's obvious right now that I need to find out about before I have a thought about this particular situation.
So like, in some ways, trade us to aware what's happening and maybe come back to it another time when you've done your own thoughts on it.
Or ask a question. I think asking the question is always allowed, rather than making assumptions.
My classic thing I tell my therapist is, we have assumptions, so before we make them, maybe we ask the question to see if those assumptions are correct, and we can do it broad and we can get closer. Being aware of our own key beliefs or ideas is so important too when we do individual and group work and when we engage with other people. I was doing a training yesterday on group therapy. one of the first things when we got to the diversity conversation was, first thing you all need to do is understand who you are and how those dynamics are gonna play.
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna teach you all this in about half an hour, and you need about a few years to do this. But that means, understanding what your white identity looks like. It could be, and this does mean we're going to identities a little bit. Look like in a setting when maybe you're a facilitator, white facilitator, that means a lot.
Yeah.
How is that going to affect different people? We're looking then at gender, we're looking then at religion. And that also means your beliefs. How are those affecting how you hear things? And then how you interpret those and how you believe those. Is a hopefully, I like to think there's a common practice for therapists, but it's a good practice for all people in relationships too. As we check in with me, how am I going to respond to that? Especially in the cross-cultural relationships when there are those differences.
Yeah.
It's maybe different opinions. And how do we let those change? So in a group scenario, because this is kind of statements being made, we want to be very aware of our thoughts and beliefs, much like we would in any place in our life, so that when they're coming up, we're noticing our reaction, we're being aware of it, we're taking note of what that means. And if we're not able to say something then, we can come back to it.
Yeah.
About it. The idea is we're trying to do all of this as aware as possible of those things, because we don't want our selves to lead the group or directions. And we have to know that we are not a robot. We're gonna have feelings, you're gonna have reactions, and it's important to be yourself and how you feel about those. So that goes to relationships too, I think.
Yeah. And I I'm thinking back to the group that we did at the Institute that you mentioned, and was to have not just the large group coming together to talk across differences and about differences, but also to have the affinity groups. So, a real need, I think, for people to find their group, and to be able to use that group as a resource. So, going in and out of situations, that fully comfortable to you. If your work situation is not the place where you have those long-term relationships, or you can't bridge difference in a way that's going to feel right for you, making sure that you have your group, whether that's your family, that's your community, your, ethnic, racial, gender, sexual orientation, identity group, and using that as the resource so that you have a sense of self, stays consistent in whatever environment that you want to go into. A lot of my work is on embodied code switching. So kind of the somatic experience of when you go in and out of different cultural settings and what identities show up. This is about that I talk about is really finding your resource within yourself. What is the one kernel of your own identity that transcends all the other ones? And that way, when you do switch, you're not giving up your whole self when you're in a different setting. So if that makes sense, it's like, if you're in an environment that doesn't feel fully comfortable, you still know who you are and who you can go back to, whether that's your family, your community. Have a resource, I think is probably the point of that, that statement.
It's really important.
I see another comment. Actually, you get to read this one. So.
Sure.
Okay. Can you see it from where you are?
I can.
Oh, good.
But while I read it,
yes,
I was actually thinking of a question in that, because I was thinking about the support part, and as we're doing this, how we're supporting ourselves in those relationships when difficult things come up. Because I don't want to exit a relationship because of a difference in culture. Usually I want to understand it, and I find myself still, I'm having trouble understanding it in a relationship, wanting to find someone to help process that. So I'm wondering what that's like for you. I don't know.
Okay. I think for me, I feel like I've been kind of in between cultures all my life. It's always a process of questioning. Is this me? Is it something else? Am I the one that needs to adjust? Am I the one that has the problem here? There's been a lot of bouncing around in my own head about how do I have relationships with other people that are not like me. And honestly, there is there are very few people like me, except for my family, I think. So I'm, my mom is Brazilian, my dad is Native American. I grew up in New Mexico. Unique. Yeah, I'm pretty unique. So unless you find another combination of Brazilian, Native American, and growing up in New Mexico, I'm not going to really find experience, and that can be a really isolating experience. And I know I'm not the only one that feels that way. So I think, what's been really helpful for me is the time to feel the feelings, and what I mean by that is if I feel hurt by an interaction, or if I feel confused by an interaction, just taking that moment to go, yeah, okay, that is what I feel. And then, is that relationship in which that happened, is that something that's valuable to me? Is that something I really want to keep in my life? If so, then what's the next thing I want to do? But really slowing down the process. I think the danger comes in when the reaction is quick and it's defensive. I totally have done that. Absolutely. Or hurtful, and that's completely natural. I get that part. But I think, especially when it's about different cultural, that pause has to happen, because the initial reaction may not have anything to do with what the intent was. And again, intent versus impact is always really important to keep in mind.
And these are when we're aware of it too.
When we're aware. I mean, look, that's in a perfect world, right? I mean, every day we're going to have encounters where it's like, I could have said this differently, or, did I really need to do
never,
or never
said that.
Or never, and watch out for social media, and watch out for, reacting in the moment, especially when it's online. That's pretty easy. That's pretty easy to do too. But, bring it down, I think.
Yeah, I like that. I appreciate you sharing that. It actually, the question almost went to the question that, which, to roughly summarize, is going to, wondering how we work across cultural relationships and in connection when they're not in good faith or are open to feedback, and especially, obviously, we're able to do this conversation, but what if people aren't maybe as open in that way, or what if they are actively hurtful to others in that way? And and I remember this kind of came up in the first webinar, so I'm slightly prepared. But answering by saying, I take some space from it, I grow up on it. And there's actually some really good tools around this too. I think nonviolent communication goes into is a great resource to try and figure out how to communicate with each other. Very hard and frustrating sometimes to learn it, honestly, but can be used in this context, because what we're relating to right now is, your whole workshop was about, how are you feeling? I don't know how many times I asked that question in obviously the right way and context to all my participants. Continuing, because a lot of people want to get to the, I'm going to think about it content-wise. Like, well, let's get to the emotional. And this question is kind of going into that. So how do you do it when people are not open to it and possibly actively hurting other people doing it?
I'm just sorry. I'm like thinking of all the times that I think I've, happened in so many different ways that I've reacted to it. It's interesting. I wish I could say it's a little bit more consistent than it was, but the one piece about it for me was, since I'm a somatic therapist, is my own body reaction to it. When I felt like up, then I would do that. And regulating myself while I was doing it, and that's not easy. So if I felt like something was said, and I don't want to get into too many specifics, but something was said that was a generalization that sounded almost like a stereotype, and it was in an environment where it was supposed to be a learning environment, I had to step up. I had to say something, and I said it in a way that, for me, in my own voice, sounded angry to me, authentic to me.
Right.
I was angry. I was angry. And it felt necessary, and it was one of those times where I thought for a moment about what the ramifications of that would be, if it would affect the other people in the room that I knew. More important for me to say what I needed to say about it, and to be seen in my own emotion around it. So it wasn't kind of a knee-jerk reaction. I could feel it coming. And for me, it was more like my heart beating fast and feeling warm. And I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to need to say some words around this example of it. But that relationship with that person who was the teacher was not one that I intended to carry forward. So in a way, I didn't have a lot of risk. Okay. So I think there's a balance of safety and risk that I do want to name in this, in that, or if you're in an environment where you are at risk of bodily harm yourself, I mean, there's no issue that's, so great that you need to like vocalize it and then be on the other end of a dangerous, situation. And given that for many, marginalized communities in this country, that it goes straight to being, a dangerous situation, different level of interaction that has to be considered as well. So in terms of like just interpersonal communication, like in an environment like education or work or whatever, I think, what's the relationship that I'm looking at preserving? Is it something that I'm going to risk losing? And am I okay with losing that? Yeah. If it's family, and I keep hearing this over and over again, especially in political times, the choices are different. This is family, right? So in some ways, I think it does become about, how do you speak your truth and still take care of yourself? Again, I would say things like, kind of somatically, how do you do that in that environment? If you don't want to be in the room when somebody's talking about it, sit out of that room without it being offensive, or, how do you do self-preservation for yourself around that? When do you want to engage? Finding your choice. Finding your choice.
Yeah. I would add that we're not going to be able to have this conversation with everybody. I know sometimes I can't have the conversation. I try to. And even the people who mean well or want to do this work, I think, can still make huge judgments and stereotypes of people. And I felt myself hurtful about it sometimes. And, but it doesn't mean we always have to. I think if you're actually feeling harmed, that's where I would get into like basic I statements. I'm feeling attacked, or I'm feeling hurt, or me. I think I need space. And if it continues that way, we have to ask ourselves. And I think someone asked for more information. And we are being broad about this. Like it could be friendships, could be general, sure. It could be romantic. And I think if this is a romantic relationship, then we have to wonder about the romantic relationship if we're feeling hurt. And if this isn't a friendship, then we might ask for other friends to help us out with these conversations. And if this isn't someone we don't even know, we have to ask ourselves a gift to this. And if it's in family, family's a whole other thing. Yeah. I've had some of these conversations with family before, and surprisingly, a lot of them went pretty well, but it took time when I was doing this work.
So I see that, can we give some more context to your question? I'll give you some context. I'll give you some examples.
I think they're asking, someone asked the question. Give more context to it. And it makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's wondering in what ways. So maybe we'll get that. But yeah, I don't know, like, if people aren't, as this person was saying, like, being clear and authentic as we are here and caring and listening to each other, work with that. And number one place to start is trying to develop a way to be open and calm and engaged with as you can. That might mean our own work around whatever that is. I find a lot of people who do get in this work, and that was me years ago. I was really angry. Yeah. I was also someone who probably wanted to shame people and be upset, and I knew that wasn't right, but I knew I was angry. And so I did my own research. I did a lot of my own work. Point I could be better sitting with people, particularly other white people, when I was talking about race and racism, and trying to have that slow conversation and listen to them and hear that what was happening for them, their frustrations of this, in their view, being a big thing, and listening, because those relationships are important. I've had long relationships, conversations with friends that normally I think in the past I would have been like, oh my gosh, I'm all frustrated. And still it's intense, but I came away with both of us being able to walk away and still smile and think of how I was able to keep myself calm
Mhm.
enough in something that would, I think in the past have upset me a lot.
Yeah.
But
Can I bring in the example of even how we advertised or how you advertised?
oh,
This
sure,
thing?
sure.
Okay.
Well,
Yeah. Which
yeah,
is a good
it
example.
wasn't quite how I advertised, but
No,
yes.
like yes, but how the marketing person did.
Mhm,
So
mhm.
yeah, basically when we first started, working to do this webinar, Philip had someone that was picked a photo. So as some of you may have seen on the website or on the on his Facebook, there was a photo of people and then talking about relationships across cultures.
Mhm.
And when I saw it, I noticed that there was no one that being a person of color. So I sent an email to Philip. But in that moment, it was really interesting. What happened is that I first kind of went, and then I was like, wait a minute, let me ask. I think that was part of, the relationship that we've developed is that there was no assumption, I guess, in one direction, it could have been like, and this is the work that we've been doing. And why didn't you just see this and blah, blah, blah. And, the other part of it was like, I know that he's busy, he's running a business. We're both busy, all that. Let me just see if that was an oversight in terms of direction to somebody to find a photo,
Sure.
So reaching out to Philip through email, I was, I was pretty honest about it. I'm like, okay, I think this is not the right picture for this kind of discussion. I think from your side, it felt like you were able to receive that and there was no defensiveness about it.
No, I think, and I felt about it too. I think I noticed it and didn't take as much action as I think I would have. I think I sent you a message about it in all our emails, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, if you think of a better photo, I this is the one I found. I noticed that there's maybe one person of color in the photo, but they're probably passing as white.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't take much more action. I didn't reach my marketing person and be like, can you find something?
Mm-hmm.
So that also says, a piece there too.
Mm-hmm. Interesting piece too is your marketing person came back and said that photos of people from different backgrounds, there aren't as many and they're not as accessible. They're not
they're not usually free.
Which I thought was an interesting kind of
it was
institutional
that was
racist piece.
Like, sorry,
so,
this is not available to the general public.
Right. Which then of course
and luckily the person found a photo that more.
Yeah.
But I think there's interesting pieces in there too.
Mm-hmm.
Because I noticed that there was someone that I thought might be a person of color.
Mm-hmm.
And cultures doesn't always mean a white person and a person of color in that instance, but it can.
Yep.
I think I see a question about that.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember, you're right. Well, let's get something that's more obvious to that.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, and it looks like there might be a person of color.
That's true.
So that might have been like, it could come up with defensiveness too. So I noticed that, and when I talk about it and think about it and process it with you, particularly, I think you've expressed to me before, sometimes feeling people white.
Right. Yeah.
So I thought, I was like, oh, okay.
But see that, and so as we're talking about it, it becomes a discussion, right?
Yeah.
So, what could have been an assumption that, okay, I'm just not going to ask him about it and it's just going to be represented in this way and whatever feelings I would have about it, that's not where I wanted to go because I value the relationship that we have. And I think it brings in more information and it gets to be part of the discussion now. Right. So I know that there was some, questions too, in terms of like, long-term relationships, romantic relationships, that kind of thing. And let me just take a look and see if this comment over here. See if I think I can actually see it.
I think most people who are on can see it, but if you're not.
Yes. Okay, so. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I do agree.
That's ideal.
That's ideal. And the thing is that I think a lot of times what happens is that not a knowledge. Good for multicultural images. Thank you. Now we know where to find them. Awesome. If someone there's kind of a double-edged sword to this. Let's say that the relationship, this is their first relationship with a person of color, right? And they love them and they don't want them to get hurt. what may happen is almost a denial of that hurt being present for them. Frustrating for the person of color, because it's like, yes, that's part of my daily life, and that's something that's never been really part of the other one's experience. It comes down to being able to sit with it, not fix it, not, not necessarily do something with it, but sit with your partner and feel the feelings. That's a challenge in any relationship with anything that's difficult, but in particular for this, I know at least for my marriage, it's incredibly important just to feel listened to, and also to have the space to express in the way that feels right to me. Be able to do it for himself as well. So to give each other space to be yourself, and also to have your community dynamics without question or judgment. Because I think that's when you're included in something like that. At least, from my native side, my husband is, comes to our feast days, and he can't participate. That's not it, but he's there as part of the family. Sometimes more an observer, but he's still part of the family. Mm-hmm. And I think he does that really well. He doesn't happen around him. And I really value that.
Yeah.
I don't know. What's your perspective on it?
A question that was asked earlier was, how we do it might be very different than others. And so I'm trying to think about, maybe ideas that might help people that might not have the same backgrounds as ourselves as far as trainings and awareness building. But I'll start with myself.
Okay.
I've had cross-racial relationships before, and I think in those, both of us were very in our race and racism within the relationship. So that's why I'm expressing it's, that is probably not common always.
Right.
But I do think of what the political world we live in, it probably needs to be a conversation in those relationships, because they're being affected all the time by other people, what people think of that, how that person is being seen, the person of color particularly, and how their life is like. And in doing so, I think, I like what you're saying, Marcy, that he listens to you, he hears, goes through and is trying to tune to that and understand. Can't understand, but I'm going to listen. So, I'm trying to understand as I can.
The difference in communication styles is a huge piece of this. So as you're saying that, I have to laugh at myself because, communication that's typical for certain cultures and kind of an indirect way. I'm an indirect communicator. My husband is a direct communicator. So the way that I talk is sort of in circles, and I get to a point eventually. Drives him nuts.
I've learned that.
Yeah. So, and it drives him nuts, and and it kind of drives me nuts when he wants me to get to a point. So
it drives you nuts.
Yeah. So realizing
what are you trying to say?
Exactly. So it's like I'm describing. I'm getting there. And he's like, no, what's the point? So
this sounds like.
Right. So just being aware that within the relationship, you're going to have different ways of communicating with each other, different ways of expressing affection, and that's always okay to just make. In fact, I would say please do make it overt, because you don't know that about the other person. You could be misinterpreting it and thinking it's all you in terms of being a personal as a person. And sometimes it makes it fun, I mean, I'll fool around with kind of the direct form of communication. Every once in a while I'll do it and he'll be shocked. So, you can always adjust.
Yeah, that's a huge piece. How do we communicate? I've learned that in my relationship. A lot of people communicate with their bodies, and that means a lot, and you have to pick up on it. And luckily, I'm pretty good at that. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes I'll be like, I just need to hear the words.
Yeah.
And luckily, in my relationship, they see that as important for me, and they provide that. And I'm hoping that they also see that I know what that means and those emotions. But it's very different in that way, and more direct. Very direct about some things, and then others says nothing. And so I have to take that into it's different than me, and that's a different cultural background. And so, I'm a very emotive person as well. So I like to describe it and feel it and talk about it. And I'll get to the point of it's business, but particularly if it's with a romantic person, I like to take my time with it. And I think learning that's like one of the number of things we do in couples is like, how have you both learned to communicate, and what did you see in your families growing up? But like number one thing you talk about. A lot of the issues in couples is not being able to communicate and having different backgrounds with that. But going a little back, because I think you came from this, like Harry. I think for people that might not have the same background or awareness or the trainings, or that don't do this for a living, maybe is a better way to put it. I think the key things to note are just that, in this case, this question is about, it sounds like a white person with a person of color in a relationship. It would be listen. No, you don't know it. You won't understand completely. You can't understand. You can listen and just do your best to understand what they're saying, and trust that. And hopefully you have a good enough relationship that you can trust what they're saying. And that I found means a lot. Just doing that basic key, and then can't completely understand, but and that's partially because I can't have your lived experience. But I want to listen, and I'll be there, and I see this is hard. Basic validation, and if people want basic validation, I'll go, Marcy, how are you feeling?
Good.
You're feeling good right now. See, that's basic validation.
Right.
And you can start there, and you can see what they're saying. Really.
And I think, as a person of color in that context, it's really checking in with yourself to see what your choice is. A lot of times we feel like we need to educate, and we need to be the ones that are going to make it better, that every situation is the one that's going to make the difference, right? Especially if it's somebody that's really not receptive to change. Have to be that way. You can do as little as just go, to show that something didn't sit right. If you want to get into a full discussion, then you give yourself the space to do that. And you can also give yourself the space to not know what to do in the moment and walk away. This is an ongoing discussion, ongoing, I think, growth process for many, many people, and in different ways, at different speeds, and in different instances. So really it's choice. If it means something to you, if the relationship means something to you, if the subject means something to you, you feel supported, then yes, go ahead and do the next step that feels right for you. And that next step could be completely nonverbal. And I'm not talking about, the fingers and all that stuff. I'm talking about, how close you want to stand to someone, or just, being in the room or not being in the room. It's really your choice. So I think that would be, my thought around that. I think that, in forging relationships across cultures, it's important to have, like I said, multiple awareness going on in terms of and privilege, potential cultural differences. It's a lot to hold. But in the end, that connection that you make with somebody is a way of learning from each other. And so make sure it's not a one-way street. Make sure it's coming both ways, that you're learning from each other, that not one of you is teaching the other, but the other is teaching you too. And that both of you have expanded, because with more horizons expanded, I think that we find, more room to connect with each other, and hopefully better ways of doing things.
I was just thinking about like our relationship in that, and I know we don't have a lot of time left. There's probably about 5 minutes. I was thinking about like our evolution, or our relationship process, and I'm thinking about more lately. And I think this came up because we're looking at office space together. And you're very like, I want this room, and you're like,
that was direct, wasn't it?
You're very like, I want this, and I was like, oh. I was like, I don't usually hear you more demand, or you're usually very, what would you like? What would you like to do? And I even find myself being like, there's something happening here. Like, is our relationship still forming or whatnot? But it was nice to me, even as much as I'm like, I don't know about that room, but it was nice because it was very this is what you were very, you weren't like trying to accommodate for me as much. It's more just to share.
Yeah.
And I found that earlier in our relationship, you were much more accommodating for me. And to the point I had to be sometimes like, no, what do you want? You keep accommodating me.
It's true.
And I think we've talked some about that, but I noticed that just the last week, particularly. Like, oh, she's me how it is, and just shift. And I was thinking about that particularly as I was teaching yesterday. I was like, you have to build trust in relationships, and a lot of times, you know, our own enactments, if that makes sense, our own pasts will replay themselves.
Yeah.
And we have to build trust to be able to change that a little bit.
Well, it might have something to do with the fact that I just got back from Brazil, and that's a very different side of me that doesn't come out that much here. So that was a lot more direct.
It was nice. I appreciate it. A couple minutes, 1 minute, I don't know. How are we doing? 1 minute? This says 4 minutes, but 4 minutes.
Okay. Is there anyone that has any questions? Something that we didn't touch on, perhaps that you're curious about?
2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes. You got 2 minutes.
Actually, I was thinking about it. Why cross-cultural relationships are important to me.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about maybe ways